Well, I am really glad to be here tonight. Glad that we've had this time together over the weekend. And I hope that you've heard some word from God, that's what you needed to hear, that He has spoken through this at some point to you. And I am grateful for your generous hospitality. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Pastor Brett and Pastor Tim, for your role in organizing this study weekend and for letting me be a part of it. And thank you, too, for opening up this weekend to folks from farther afield. I'm glad you've joined us. So we're talking about prayer tonight, and this seems to me like the perfect way to wrap up our weekend, because prayer really enfolds all that we do and all that we are. And everything comes together in prayer, because it's in prayer that our vision and our work are transfigured to God. And I'm convinced that we need a renewal of prayer in the life of the church and in our lives as individuals. I'm convinced that prayer is the secret fire that fuels the church. Our superpower is prayer. Now, I don't want this to sound like a cat poster, but prayer changes things. Okay, so, or better yet for our time tonight, I think that prayer transfigures things, because prayer transfigures our vision and prayer transfigures our work. And so I want to invite you to just start thinking a little bit about a time when God answered a prayer in your life. Okay, what was that? What was it like? And I'm going to come back to that and invite you to share with your whoever's near you about a time that God answered a prayer. But first I want to tell you a story. It's about a church planter and a toaster. So a man named Chet Eshelman, who is a church planter in Ohio, in small town Ohio, tells the story of how he was facing a lot of challenges in church planting, right? It's difficult work. And so he had this place in a little wooded area near the town, and he would go up there, he had a chair, and he would sit in that chair in this wooded area, and he would just pray his heart out to God. And so he'd go up there and sit in the chair and pray about all the challenges that they were facing, right? The challenges of finances, the challenges of connecting with people, the challenges of organizing a new church when you don't really have people, the structures and the people there to support you. And he'd pray about that. And one morning, in the midst of all those challenges, as he's getting ready to go out the door, the toaster breaks in their kitchen, and his wife says, his wife was a nurse, and she went off to do her thing. And she said, "By the way, Chet, the toaster's broke. We need a new toaster." And that for him was just kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back. So Chet goes out to his chair and out there to pray. And he's praying. He's like, "God, we've got all these challenges, the paying the bills and reaching new people. And also, God, the toaster. Just, by the way, God, we need a new toaster." And he just threw that in there. And so Chet goes back down to the church after his time of prayer, and as he's getting out of his car and walking up to the outside of the church where they're planting this building that they had purchased, and where they were renovating it for their church sanctuary. And as he's walking up to the door of that, this minivan pulls up, and a gentleman rolls down the window and says, "Are you the pastor of this church?" He's like, "Yeah, that's me." And he says, "Well, I was just cleaning out our house, and I wanted to give you something to kind of just support your work. Hold on." And the man reaches down in there and pulls out a toaster and hands it through the window to Chet. He's like, I had this toaster, and I thought you could use it." So now I think that all of us, if we reflect a little bit, will have some experiences kind of like that, right? We'll have a toaster story. Because God is good, and God is faithful, and God hears prayer. I think that all of us will have a time when God has come in and done something when we couldn't do it on our own. So I want to invite you, just talk to somebody next to you, kind of huddle for a minute like we did last night, and tell them your toaster story, right? Do you have, in a few words, is there a time when you prayed and God answered your prayer? Tell that story. Talk about that with someone next to you for a couple of minutes. So let's kind of bring it back together. We're talking about prayer, and I'm convinced that prayer changes things, that prayer transfigures our life and our work. And so often we look at the life of following Jesus, and we can think about that life, we can conceive of Christian life as doing certain things, right, or not doing certain things. Or we can sum up Christian life as believing certain fundamentals. And all that is true, but doing or not doing or believing by themselves don't get to the secret heart of discipleship, which has a supernatural component. We are walking with Jesus, this person who existed and who exists and who continues to exist for all eternity, who's present to his people through the Holy Spirit. And sometimes I think our understanding of Christian faith can kind of leave out that supernatural reality that Jesus is real and he wants to save your life. And for me, this has been so important. One of the great journeys of my own life has been to go from a thinking faith to a praying faith, moving from knowing about God to knowing God. And my mind has gradually descended into my heart, to use the words that Richard Foster used to describe the great Christian philosopher Dallas Willard. Because you see, in the end, Christian life is less about knowledge than about encounter. Christian faith is about meeting Jesus. The gospel is not an idea, it's an encounter. And we will encounter Jesus through his word. We'll encounter Jesus in the bread and the cup shared at the communion table. We'll encounter Jesus in his people. But the place where we will encounter Jesus day in and day out is prayer. It's been my experience. And when I look at the people who knew Jesus in the New Testament, when I look at the great saints across the ages, when I look at people that I know that are walking in his way, like that seems to be their experience too, that they meet him through prayer. And I think one of the gifts that we bring to the world as followers of Jesus is this living encounter with Jesus. It's not just that we are nicer than everybody else or that we have better ideas than everybody else. It is that Jesus is alive within us, that Jesus shows up through us, and we cultivate that presence of Jesus through prayer. That's where we're opened up to him. And I think the same thing goes for the life of the church. In the church, our temptation is always to reduce everything to some kind of a social organization. And the world can never wrap its entertainment-addled brain around the secret genius of the church. The world will always think the church is a club or something, and that pastors are kind of these overpaid club secretaries. And the reason the world can never fully understand the church is because the church is not entirely a human organization. The church is a divine human reality, a supernatural reality. It's what the New Testament calls the body of Christ. And one of the key components of cultivating that divine human reality is prayer, because prayer opens up the church to the action and the leadership of the Holy Spirit. The world just can't get that part. And half the time, the church doesn't get that part either. We are always tempted, I think, to reduce the life of the church to strategy, to think that if we just hire the right people, maybe a young pastor, just hire the right people, play the right songs, install a smoke machine, then all of our problems will go away. It's okay to laugh at that. Or we reduce the life of the church to a string of business meetings. The church, we think, sometimes, is about keeping the Ten Commandments, following the Sermon on the Mount, and strict adherence to Robert's Rules of Order. But the secret heart of the church is discovered in prayer. I think we've got to be a praying people. And I don't want to lay this on you as some kind of a guilt trip. I don't mean pray. You ought to pray like you ought to eat your broccoli. I'm not trying to shake my finger at you all like that. You need to pray more. I don't think that's the best idea. We were driving once and saw a semi that had this on the back of the semi, right? That was his message to the world. Did you pray today? Did you pray today? But I want to invite all of us to grow as people of prayer. God is a God of love, and he invites us into relationship to him through prayer. And Jesus says a lot about prayer. He teaches about prayer as one of his 3 key spiritual disciplines in the Sermon on the Mount. So in Matthew chapter 6, he talks about fasting and giving and prayer. That's where he teaches the Lord's Prayer. And prayer, he says pray and don't give up. He says if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can move mountains. But one of the passages that I think is especially valuable for us in the rural church and in small town churches to think about prayer is the story of the Transfiguration. And I want to read that. It's in 3 of the Gospels, but I'm going to read the version from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, and I will read verses 28 to 36. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. Why did he go up on the mountain?
To pray.
To pray. Okay. Can we all say that? To pray. All right. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which was about to be accomplished at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. Now, the Transfiguration, right? The Transfiguration is this time when Jesus takes his 3 closest students, his friends, Peter, James, and John, and they go up the mountain with him. And I want to look really at the first 2 verses of this in detail, because we saw that, right? Why did Jesus go up on the mountain? Verse 28, he went up on the mountain with them to pray. And then what does he do when he's on the mountain? Verse 29, he prays with them, right? So while he is praying, and so this is a story that begins in prayer, and it actually it actually ends in prayer in the Gospel of Mark as well. They come down the mountain and they're praying for this little boy that is possessed by a demon, right? So it begins in prayer and it ends in prayer, at least in the Gospel of Mark. And so I kind of want to take this story of the Transfiguration as a parable of prayer for the rural and small town church. Now, in a lot of ways, this is a rural story because Jesus takes Peter, James, and John away from the hustle and bustle of cities and towns and other people, and he goes up the mountain with them to pray. And he was in the habit of doing that. If you look at the Gospels, you see that Jesus was always stepping back from the hurly-burly of life. He was going out onto the hills into deserted places to pray. And the disciples would wake up in the morning and would look around and they'd wonder, well, where had Jesus gotten to? And people would come to the house looking for him, and he wouldn't be there. He was not available. He was off praying. But what's most important, I think, about this story of Transfiguration is not so much that it's rural. I mean, it's really a message for the whole church, rural, urban, or otherwise. What I see as a message in the Transfiguration, that prayer and transfiguration are linked. So Jesus takes them out to pray, and then he is transfigured before them. He is praying himself, and then he is transfigured in the midst of that time of prayer. And there are a couple of Greek words that are used for transfiguration in the gospel. And in Matthew and Mark, the word in Greek is related to the word for metamorphosize. So metamorphosize. If you remember back to high school biology, metamorphosis is what caterpillars go through when they become butterflies or moths, right? Or tadpoles undergo metamorphosis and they become frogs. So they change from one shape to another. Now in Jesus' case, he doesn't become something different. He is revealed for who he truly is. So in Jesus' case, he is metamorphosized so that they see his true nature. He's the Lord of glory, and the unseen light of God shines through him in a way that is nearly overwhelming to the disciples. Now in Luke, that word is simply changed. He was changed. So Jesus' face is changed while he was in prayer. And so I see this link between Jesus' transformation and prayer. He is who he is, and the prayer doesn't change him. But when Jesus prays, he is revealed to be who he is, the Son in whom God is well pleased, the one that we should listen to. And he's inviting the disciples into this transformative, transfigurative power of prayer. That's why he brought them with him. Prayer transfigures him. Prayer transfigured our lives. And the first thing I think that prayer does when we talk about transfiguration is that it changes and transfigures our vision. So the disciples saw Jesus for who he really was. They got a glimpse of God's reality, the really real. And we, I think, are also shaped by what we pay attention to. So in Christian tradition, in the tradition of spirituality, the word for paying attention to God is contemplation, right? So we speak of contemplative prayer. That is paying attention to God, being in the presence of God, focusing on God. It's the kind of prayer that opens us up to the realization that you see in the Psalms, that the whole earth is full of his glory. And for us as followers of Jesus, it's the kind of prayer, contemplative prayer, that helps us see the Jesus-ness of the moments and places that we find ourselves in. Now, in rural and small towns, I think this kind of prayer, this contemplative prayer, is vitally important because it's really what allows us to have a changed vision for the situation that we're in. It allows us to have a re-enchanted vision of place where we see God saturating all places with his glory and his love, and he's inviting us to see that, to follow him in a deeper way. And I think in small towns and rural places where there can sometimes be a sense of despair, a sense of boredom, a sense that maybe we're missing out. Maybe nothing matters, right? Maybe what the real action is off somewhere else. I think prayer is what helps us see through to the really real, to God behind the scenes. Now, have any of you heard of Weldon Keys? Does that name ring a bell here? Okay, Weldon Keys is a native son of Beatrice. He is a poet. Maybe there's a Weldon Keys house or something like that. His parents were the ones who had founded the factory, the implement factory that eventually became Husqvarna, which I understand is no longer here. But Weldon Keys was a poet, and he wrote very bleak poetry. He went off and traveled. He was in New York City for a while, and then he ended up in California, and then he just disappeared. And some people claim that he's still alive. But Weldon Keys wrote this bleak poetry. He has one poem called Travels in North America. And he describes the feeling of disassociation, of moving across the country, right? Whizzing past these tiny towns. And he says in one of his poems, in this poem, Travels in North America, here is San Luis Obispo. Here is Kansas City, and here is Rovere, Kentucky, and here, a small black dot, unpronounceable but hard to forget, is where we stopped at the Seraphim Hotel. You know, I wonder, in our rural communities, in our small towns, are we the ones that are living in that small black dot, the one that he just whizzed by? And do we sometimes have that sense, does anything that we do here matter? Now, there is a word for this kind of despair, that questioning of if anything matters. And in the ancient catalogs, it's actually classed as one of the 7 deadly sins, and the word for it is Acedia. Can you say that with me? Acedia. Okay. So for the ancient monks, for people that dedicated their lives to prayer, there was always the temptation to just give up on the whole project. This is a bunch of hooey. I'm going back to the city. Life is easier there. Get out of the desert. Get out of these little rocky places where they're living on bread and water and trying to spend their days in prayer. And Acedia was one of the sins that would strike them hard. They called it the noonday demon. You know, Psalm 91 in some translations says, Lord, protect us from the noonday demon. That's where they got that from. And because, you know, after you eat your lunch, how do you feel? You know, a little tired. Well, the monks did too, right? They eat their bit of bread and their water, and they felt a little tired, and they'd sit there in despair. Does any of this matter? And Acedia would strike them, that noonday demon. But you know, if Acedia is a noonday demon, then it's kind of a gray blur, sort of a malignant dust bunny of a demon. Acedia is just this seeping feeling of blah, nothing matters. And Acedia is a sin because it's a failure to find joy in God. It's a failure to see through to the really real, to recognize the presence of God and to see God's leading and grace and love in our lives. And what Acedia does is it makes us restless. It makes us annoyed. It makes us question whether anything that we do matters. And Acedia also happens to be my deadly sin of choice. But we conquer this sin through prayer. Now, I think this is a particular challenge for communities, for small-town and rural communities, because we can be faced with that sense that, does any of this matter? Are we in the right place? Are we doing things that count for something across the grand scheme of things? And we're not helped by many other factors. And I've mentioned this a little bit, but for instance, our larger society often doesn't value small town and rural places, right? And sends us off looking for opportunity in big cities and suburban areas. And the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, has developed something called the Natural Amenities Index. And what they've done is gone through and rate every county in the United States by its natural amenities. So if you have so many square miles of open water, you get X number of points. If you've got mountains that, they give different ratings to different heights of mountains, you get so many points. If you've got hills, they give different rates for height of hills, and they give ratings for open plain areas. And they calculate this, and what comes out the other end is the kind of the beauty rating and one number for a county. And the challenge to this is that if you look at a map of this, and you can Google this, the USDA Natural Amenities Index, if you look at a map, you see kind of like the two coasts are really, they're scoring high, right? Like they've got water and mountains and hiking, and it kind of goes down into Florida. And there's this vast swath across the middle that scores very low. So Gage County, Nebraska, on their scale, actually is negative 2.26. But don't feel bad. McPherson County, Kansas, where we live, and a place that we love, we're negative 1.81. So if you're picking a place to live, I guess you could weigh that, right? Like 0.26 and 0.81. Well, so there's these strange factors that conspire to disparage rural communities and to not be able to look out at the Great Plains and see that big sky and see something that is gorgeous and that is beautiful and that is full of the presence of God. And I think it's so easy to fall into that rut of disparaging place and then disparaging mission and then disparaging purpose and wondering if any of this matters in this place. I think the key to getting back and getting away from that is prayer. I think about the story of Jacob in Genesis 28. Jacob's trying to get away from his brother Esau, and he's trying to find a bride. And as Jacob journeys, the day grows long, and he's got to find a place to stop. And he stops in this nameless place, right? It just says in the scriptures in Genesis 28 that it's somewhere between Beersheba and Haran. Right? So it's trod over territory. And it's this nameless place that he has a layover in, but thankfully its stones make good pillows. And so Jacob camps out there in this non-place. But then in the night he has this dream. And you know the story, right? The angels of God are ascending and descending, and he wakes up and he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, though I did not know it." And he calls that place Bethel. Right, the Bethel, the house of God. He wakes up to the reality of God's presence in that place. And I think we've got to have that kind of a Jacob-like awakening about the presence of God. And I think prayer is the way into it, that we start to pay attention to God and see people and places with God's eyes, which are always the eyes of love. Now, when we first moved to Eastern Washington and we're getting settled in, I remember a family friend talked to my mom and dad and said, "Now, where did they end up again?" And they told him. He said, "Oh, I've been through there. That's one of the most God-forsaken places I've ever driven through." And I'm embarrassed to say that I kind of agreed with him at first. Miles of open sagebrush. It's not exactly the stuff of postcards, but over time, we grew to have a love for that place, and especially a love for the people. Prayer started to transfigure our vision. I think we got to have that. Now, the second piece is that prayer transfigures our work. So in this passage, when we talk about the transfiguration, Peter, James, and John up on the mountain with Jesus, Peter wants to do some work, right? Verse 33, he's like, let's start a building project. Let's build 3 shelters. It won't take long. This will be a great way to remember our past wilderness wanderings with the Israelites, and we can honor this moment. We'll set up these shelters. It can be like little chapels for you, Jesus. We'll set this up, one for you, Elijah, and Moses. But the scriptures say he did not know what he was saying. So he has this idea that he's going to get in there. Peter has this idea that he's going to get in there and do work with his hands. But it turns out that the work he needed to do in that moment is not the work of setting up shelters. The work that he needed to do was the work of prayer. That's why Jesus had invited him up there to see for who he really was and to join him in prayer. And I think that prayer does work that we cannot do, and prayer is a part of the work that we must do in any congregation, but especially in our rural and small-town churches. Now, in the Neuland colony in Paraguay, there's these Mennonite colonies in Paraguay. Mennonites who settled in Paraguay, many of them, at different times, many of them showed up. You probably know this story well, right? Many of them showed up after World War II as refugees, and the Neuland colony was actually settled specifically by Mennonite ladies and kids, and they were widows, right? So they had some farmland and some basic implements, and that was the beginning of the Neuland colony. And there's a statue in Neuland colony that says on it, Ora et labora. Now, I don't know how they got a hold of that. Ora et labora. It means pray and work. I don't know how the Mennonites in Neuland Colony, Paraguay, got a hold of that saying, pray and work, but it's actually an ancient monastic saying. So Saint Benedict, who's this man in the 5th century who organized monks, those are men who dedicate their lives to prayer. That is their focus, prayer, monks. He drew monks together and he organized them so that they would have these places that were well ordered and the work would get done, but they could also be dedicated to prayer. And that was his motto, Ora et labora. And in fact, that was his motto. I think we'll come back to that. Ora et labora, pray and work. And it reminds me a little bit of 1 Thessalonians 4:11, where Paul says, I urge you all to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, right? So it's this idea of living out your faith, but at the same time, doing the work with your hands that you need to do. It also reminds me of the story of Nehemiah in Nehemiah 4:17. And this is such a Sunday school story, right? Where Nehemiah comes back. And you remember that the people of Israel had been removed from the land and they'd gone off to Babylon in exile. And they start coming back in waves. And Nehemiah comes back as this rebuilder figure. And his task is to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem that have been destroyed and fallen down. And so Nehemiah comes and he goes around the wall and he inspects it. And then he starts the laborers to work. But they're under threat from people who are trying to stop their work. And so the story in Nehemiah 4:17 is that they're working with one hand, and in the other hand, they have their weapon, right? They've got their sword or their spear. And so, there's my Sunday school picture of it. But, you see them, they've got the trowel on the one hand, and they've got their sword in the other hand, right? And they're doing the work of rebuilding the wall, but at the same time, they've got their swords, so sword and trowel. And I think about what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 6:7. Paul said, we are God's servants. We are about God's ministry of reconciliation. And we come with, listen to this, weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left. Paul says that we come with these two weapons of righteousness. And Paul also talks about seeing ourselves as co-workers with God. So 1 Corinthians 3:9, right? He says, we are building and we are planting with God. We are co-workers with God. The theological term for that is a term that's made it into our common language. It's synergy, right? That's actually the exact word. He says we are synergos with God. Synergy, that we are working together with God. It's a word that describes the relationship between God's grace and human freedom. And so I kind of put this together, and I see this image of sword and trowel, right? The weapons of righteousness in the right hand and the left. The prayer that is our sword, right? The prayer, the sword of the Spirit. Prayer in one hand, and work with the other, the trowel. And so we come to rural communities with this transfigured understanding of work. We're working together with God. And in our rural communities and in our small towns, I think this is so important because many of our biggest problems are not fixable. Or at least they're not fixable by elbow grease. And so I think we have to start to see ourselves as working alongside God through prayer. That's hard for most of us because most of us are kind of like Peter. And we want to do something immediate and concrete. We want to build shelters, but Jesus is calling him to do the cloud work of prayer. It was perfect that we started with this reading about entering into the cloud. That's what we're called to do. And entering into that cloud means embracing uncertainty. It means exercising patience. We start to see ourselves as having the sword of prayer in one hand and the trowel of hard work in the other. So I think prayer opens up doors that we cannot open on our own. I think this happens a lot of times in mysterious ways, and I think this is vital in the rural church. So one day, it was a Sunday afternoon, and I'm in my kitchen, and I see a man who I have seen on the street before but never talked to walk up to our door, and I'm like washing my hands or something in the kitchen. I see him walk up to the door, and I hear no knock, and I hear no doorbell. And so I kind of run over to the door, and I open up the door, and he's like walking away. And I'm like, can I help you? And he's like, you're a pastor, right? I'm like, yeah. And he says, can we talk? And we go and sit down, we go over to the church, we sit down in my office, and this opens up into this whole conversation about life and faith and like where he's at, and like, what does God want for me, right? This whole conversation. And I didn't know him from Adam, and he didn't know me. And we had this conversation, and I came back afterwards after he had gone on his way, and I said to my wife, I said, okay, that is why we pray and fast. Because we just don't know what's happening behind the scenes, right? We just don't know the ways that God is working to bring people together, that God is placing people in our path to open a door. And so we're praying our way into this reality. That is why we pray. That's why we fast. And when I've talked to churches that are thriving, one of the key pieces that I've heard in all those conversations is prayer. In fact, in Ed Stetzer's book, Comeback Churches, and Ed Stetzer's an evangelical leader out of Wheaton College. He writes for Christianity Today. In his book, Comeback Churches, he talks about strategic prayer as one of the top 3 turnaround factors for churches. So he went out and they did a study of 300 churches that had gone from declining to thriving. They said, what were the common factors? And prayer was one of the top 3. Now, at the beginning of our time tonight, I'd asked you to tell a story of a time when God answered your prayer. Now think back to that. Because, I think that is just a foretaste of the kind of thing that God desires for his people. And I think all of us have had those experiences, and I think, in my case, I hunger for more of that, right? That to have things happen as we grow as a people of prayer. Let's see if my other one is up there. It is not. Okay. To see that prayer, to see ourselves growing in prayer, to see God doing that work in prayer. There's an Orthodox saint in the Orthodox Church. His name's Hesychios the priest. And he said that without prayer, we merely hunt after earthly things. There is nothing that matters that happens without prayer. And so I think that this means that we've got to learn to start to see the life of the church as sword and trowel work, elbow grease and prayer, ora et labora. But I think it also means that prayer is what gives meaning to our work. That without prayer, it's just one thing after another. It's just committee meetings and process and Robert's Rules of Order. And what kind of a life is that? After Jesus came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, he told his disciples the parable of the mustard seed. And he said, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. That all happens through prayer. It's through prayer that our vision and our work are transfigured to God. Amen.